You wouldn't think spring was around the corner, but obviously it is. As the ground warms up, the plants begin their reproduction. So we've got a little plum tree behind us, flowering, and I thought, why not keep to the topic? Let's look at food. Remember the old saying, we are what we eat? Well, I'm not a great believer in it. Maybe physically we are what we eat. But are we psychologically what we are what we eat? Now, if those of you who are aware of those 19th century Western caricatures of the rich in working class magazines and leaflets in newspapers, you'll always notice that the rich were fat and the workers were skinny. Bring the clock forward to 125 years, 130 years, and as far as the Western world is concerned, and increasing parts of the rest of the globe, which is catching up with the Western world's rate of consumption, the unemployed, the workers are fat, and the ruling classes are skinny, or good proportion. So what's happened? What's happened in the space of around 150 years that things have dramatically changed, and does it have an impact on people's lives? Well, we know today that the more adipose tissue you carry in a Western society, you're greater the chances of cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarctions, cerebrovascular accidents, type 2 diabetes, increasing cholesterol and triglycerides. And all of these have an impact on us. And there's also the new theory, or relatively new theory, regarding the importance of the gut biome. Not just in terms of the physical status of an individual, but their psychological conditioning. So there's all this information pouring out of scientific journals around the world that highlights that there are issues in terms of health, major issues in terms of health and health budgets in both the Western societies, hyper-developed Western societies, and developing parts of the rest of the world. So what's happened? Well, we've moved in terms of the way food is produced, packaged, and consumed. We've seen the corporatisation of the food production process. A corporatisation which begins on the farm, a corporatisation process which is instrumental in producing food for mass consumption and mass distribution, and a corporatisation process in terms of removing food preparation from the home into the hands of privately owned businesses and corporations. Now, obviously, eating fresh, because of a lack of refrigeration, was an important component of food production post the early parts of industrialisation and pre-industrialisation. And people basically ate what was around at that particular point in time. You weren't able to get mangoes in London from Northern Australia 150 years ago. The whole process of food production has changed dramatically. Now, with increasing populations, where we've moved from around 1.5 billion to 8 billion people in the last century or so, there is increased pressure on production, and many methods of traditional food production are inefficient, not in terms of the quality of the food they produce, but in terms of the amount of food that is required. So what we've seen, especially in Australia, what we've seen is the corporatisation of food production, whether it's grazing or whether it's actually agriculture. And we've seen more and more and more corporations dominating food production, not just for local consumption, but for export. And what this has created is a race to produce food at an accelerated rate. And that accelerated rate means exhausting the land, using more and more fertilisers and chemicals to keep up production. Because the bigger the entities, the more difficult it is to continue production without a decrease in profits. And when many of these corporations are basically listed on the stock market, what that means is that return to investors is more important than the agricultural process and the type of food that's produced. Now that we have refrigeration and many other forms of keeping foods, what we've seen is local production at the source being transformed into corporate production in large industrial estates, where milk and meat and agricultural products and grains are brought to a central location, and there they are manipulated or processed in order to ensure that profits are made. So what's happening as far as food production is concerned, that we are seeing more and more additions to these natural products. And these additions, we're talking about things like salt, sugars, chemicals. We're seeing these additions not just in food for adults, but in foods for babies, post-weaning, a whole series of powdered milk substances which have additions to them. And what this means is it actually changes the palate of the baby and then the child, and in many regards they become addicted to the high salt content, the high fat content, the high carbohydrate content, and the high sugar content in that food. So when you are producing things for mass sale, let's not forget that 3 major corporations dominate over 85 to 90% of the food distribution market in this country. What actually happens is that we see that more and more and more and more mass-produced foods with high fat contents, high sugar contents, high salt contents appear on these supermarket shelves. And these are the goods that are most affordable. So if you have a limited budget and you're concerned about rent or your mortgage, and you're concerned about the array of bills that you receive every week, and you're concerned about your type of work you do and the income you derive from that work, what you see is that people with limited incomes gravitate to the cheaper products on the shelves, because very few people buy fresh. We don't have the time anymore. You know, in any household you need 2 people to be working full time in order to meet our financial commitments. And that's, you know, the great thing about the 21st century is the fact that more and more people are involved in the productive process, to the detriment of the health of that family unit, to the health of the community, and to the health of society as a whole. And that's why we see escalating healthcare costs, especially in the public and private healthcare sector, as more and more people are faced with the dilemma of developing preventable diseases which need chronic management. So this is the dilemma. So what we've seen is the reversal of the idea that to be fat is to be healthy. Obviously, if you have a lot of adipose tissue, you have an increasing number of healthcare problems. And that's why we see that the ruling classes, those who have the disposable income, spend more and more of that disposable income not on buying prepackaged food or takeaway food, but on buying fresh food which may or may not be prepared in that household. And at the same time, they have the disposable income to have personal trainers, to attend gyms, and to do all the necessary work that is required in a society that's basically sedentary, where very few people walk in order to keep fit. So we've got major issues. Now this has been compounded in the last 20 years or so, but what I describe as the corporatisation of home cooking. It's ironical when here in the West we are confronted with more cooking programs and recipes that we've ever been confronted with, and we find ourselves in a situation because of work pressures that 2 people have to work in order to keep a household afloat, that little attention is actually paid to the quality of the food. It's about fast food. To make matters worse, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, there is more and more information coming out of scientific journals that the gut biome plays an important part, not just in our physical health, not just in terms of chronic illnesses, but in terms of psychological health. And it could be the increasing levels of anxiety and reactive depression we see in the Australian community are not just a byproduct of increasing pressure, but they may be a byproduct of the type of gut biome which is commonly found in Australian people. As we eat more and more prepackaged food, we rely on outside authorities to cook that food for us, and in even more ridiculous situations we have companies which bring in food which is pre-prepared. So there are prices to be paid for health, and these prices mean that if you wish to have a healthy lifestyle, you need to think about the type of food you buy and preparation of that food. I'm not saying that people should be vegans or vegetarians, but the fact is that a vegan or vegetarian diet is a much cheaper diet than a diet which is based on meat and fish products, ocean products. The fact is that even on a low income, you can buy food in season, vegetables and fruits in season at reasonable prices because of the large numbers which are placed on the market at one time. To try to decrease the amount of packaged foods is critical in terms of both our long-term health and the health of the people around us and our family and friends. It doesn't matter how many diet pills you take, how many gyms you go to, how many injections you have. Ultimately, weight loss is about calories in and energy which is expended by that individual. Now obviously a lot of people are not able to expend energy for a variety of reasons, the sedentary lifestyle, lack of time, the list goes on and on. But in terms of calories in, we do have that ability to regulate the calories in. What it means is not running through a supermarket, picking up this package and that package and throwing them in the bottom of a container of a trolley and then having them, processed at a checkout. The actual time necessary to eat well is well spent. Not all fruit and vegetables are found in supermarkets. There are still many fruit and vegetable shops that continue to exist despite the unfair competition they face. We don't have to eat meat every day. We don't have to eat seafood every day. We can put our faith in the grains, rice, wheat, millet, barley, things that are relatively cheap but difficult, or more time, not difficult, but more time consuming to prepare. So what we see as society becomes faster and faster and faster and faster, we see decreased health outcomes in the community as a whole, especially in people who have limited incomes who find it difficult to access fresh food. We see this specifically in isolated regional Indigenous communities where fresh food is basically off the agenda because of the prices involved. Now, I've been a great believer in setting up a whole series of state subsidised restaurants around the country where people on limited incomes could come and eat meals that are calorific in terms of their health for a reasonable price. Because something needs to be done. It's not just a matter for the individual, it's a matter for society as a whole. And if we wish to improve health outcomes, if we wish to improve psychological as well as physical health, it's important that more and more and more effort is put into the task of ensuring that every person in this country has access to a healthy diet. Whether they accept it or not is their problem. But ultimately, we need a situation where people do have options. And the thing about not having disposable income is that your options are limited. And if your options are limited to such an extent that your physical and psychological health is at risk, and we see this on a daily basis around the country, then it's time that we had intervention by governments at the local, state and federal level to ensure that people have access to what can only be described as foods that are necessary to maintain people's health. In the end, the small amount of funds which are directed in that area would be more than paid for by the improved health outcomes, both physical and psychological, in society as a whole.